Well, John Howard was the Prime Minister at the time of the September the 11th attacks, and he was actually in Washington when they took place. He quickly pledged Australia's support to the United States, and he went on to send Australian troops into the wars in Afghanistan and then Iraq. I spoke with Mr Howard earlier today. Mr Howard, 10 years on, are your memories of that day still vivid? Do you remember the confusion, the anxiety?
My recollection's very vivid. I remember the shock and disbelief because it came with no warning from nowhere. It was not in any context of a growing tension between the United States and Al-Qaeda. It was just an extraordinarily brutal, unjustified, unforgivable event, and it took everybody by surprise. But interestingly enough, the other recollection I have is that everybody reacted very calmly. They knew something quite event-changing had happened, but people were calm, and that's a very vivid recollection I have. So on this anniversary, what is your message to Australians as we look at what's happened throughout the world 10 years? Well, my message is twofold, that this could go on for some time yet, the fight against terrorism. I said on the 12th of September 2001 that just as the Cold War lasted a very long time and defined several generations, so the fight against terrorism could last a very long time and define several generations. So you think the war on terrorism will always be with us, that it's not ever going to be over? It's not like a conventional war. We tend to think of wars in terms of declarations and armies running across borders, horrific fights, loss of life, and then an unconditional surrender. That's World War I, World War II. But this is not like that. It's a borderless war. It's a different thing altogether. The other message, I think, is that difficult though the last 10 years has been, it could have been much worse if the West had not taken the measures that it did. We've spent a lot of money on security, we've spent a lot of money on intelligence, but it's been worthwhile. We have foiled further terrorist attacks. Al-Qaeda is not as strong an organisation as it was 10 years ago. We've formed some very valuable partnerships with countries like Indonesia in our own region to fight terrorism. It's easy to point out the difficulties. It's easy to say we've got a corrupt government in Afghanistan. We do. But it's easy to say we've got a difficult situation in Pakistan, and that is true. On the other hand, we have made progress, and if we'd not done the things that we've done, there would have been a greater loss of life and we would be worse off. Because on this anniversary, there is a bit of a debate about whether or not it's been worth it. I know that President Barack Obama this weekend has said that America is stronger. However, there are some people who argue that America isn't stronger, that the war on terrorism has been a terrible distraction from things such as the economy, for example, and that America is now paying a terrible price for being focused too heavily on this fight against terrorism. Well, whenever something goes on for a long time, particularly wars, people grow weary and they become less popular. That is certainly true. There would have been periods during the Cold War, a different war, where people would have said, "Look, this is, not worth the effort. Why do we keep spending money on armaments? Why do we put men on the moon? Why do we do all these things to demonstrate how strong we are and keep up our military and other technological capacity?" And it's particularly true of the US. I don't think America's economic woes are the direct result of the war on terror. They're the result of other failures. They're the result of having a housing loans policy which threw money at people who had no capacity to repay loans, and other failures relating to the financial system. And that would have happened whether we were in Afghanistan or whether we'd gone into Iraq. They are really disconnected events as to cause. Obviously, the extra military and security drain on the United States does have an impact on the economy, but it's not the cause of the weak American economy. That is just not a logical argument. 10 years ago, could you have ever imagined that Australian troops would still be in Afghanistan a decade later? I don't think I turned my mind to that. You don't. You decide what should be done in the short term, and I guess I had an open mind on that. It's not something that I directed my mind to. You obviously hoped that you could participate and then, with minimum casualties, then be out in a fairly short period of time. But the nature of these wars involves and produces long engagements.
Because a lot of Australians are now questioning the mission in Afghanistan. You've mentioned that there is a corrupt government in Afghanistan. There are question marks too about the capability of the security forces, the Afghan National Police as well. What do you say to people who are frustrated about, is the mission worth it? Is it ever going to be worth it?
Well, I understand that, but I think it is worth it. And the military side of it, according to my advice, is getting better. And although there are problems in Afghanistan, there is corruption. There's no point in denying, but everything in many countries relating to corruption is relative. That doesn't mean that there would be a much worse situation if the Taliban and their affiliates took over. Of course there would, and there'd be all the suppression of women's rights and so forth that went with that. The mission in Afghanistan is to deny a safe haven to terrorists and to leave the country when there is a reasonable capacity for that country through its forces and police look after itself. We are closer to that day now than we were 5 years ago. As to exactly what that day will be, what the date is, I can't tell you. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows.
Now, I know you still have a keen interest in following what happens in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you were the Prime Minister who sent troops into both of those places. That's a very, burdensome responsibility. Do you still think about that, when you hear, for example, of the latest combat deaths, particularly in Afghanistan?
Yes, I feel very keenly about that. I follow the welfare of our men and women in Afghanistan anxiously and closely, and I think a lot about it. It was ultimately my decision. I accept that. It's a position that's been maintained by the present government, and I support the Gillard government's current position, and I note that the opposition is giving complete bipartisan support. So there's no political divide over our commitment to Afghanistan. There were differences over Iraq, but that is now in the past. There are some hopeful signs in Iraq. The Iraqis voted on 5 occasions in democratic elections against the most fearful intimidation. That must mean that they rather like the idea of a democratic future, and for all the pain the country's been through, particularly during the Saddam Hussein period and the difficulties that followed the Allied military operation, it looks to me as if Iraq wants to have a democratic future, and the whole Middle East is changing. And I find all of that promising. I always think it's a good idea when people who haven't had democracy show an interest in it and try and embrace it.
Well, if we're looking ahead to the next 10 years, for example, and emerging threats, where do you think they might be coming from? Are you more concerned, for example, about Pakistan, or is it Iran, Syria, North Korea?
Well, I'm certainly worried about the stability of Pakistan. Pakistan is a very unstable country. There are clearly very radical Islamic extremist elements in that country. I would be very concerned if we left Afghanistan too early and some of that instability in Pakistan were given more air in which to breathe, and that could well happen. And Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state.
Well, when you say you would be worried if we left Afghanistan too early, there is a projected withdrawal date of 2014. Are you comfortable with that date?
Well, I don't think that is a total... I don't think President Obama has quite set that in cement, although he's looking to that. Look, I can only say that we should leave when those two goals are achieved. And the first goal is to be satisfied that the safe haven's been denied. And the second goal is to feel that we're leaving behind a tolerable capacity for the Afghans to manage their own affairs and to look after their defence and their security.
But Afghanistan aside, you're now more worried about Pakistan.
Well, I'm not more worried. I'm worried that if Afghanistan doesn't survive on its own, that will aggravate the situation in Pakistan. Therefore, the circumstances of the withdrawal of Afghanistan are critical to the future prospects of more stability in Pakistan.
If we come a bit closer to home, Australia has been lucky that there hasn't been a terrorist attack on our home soil, but of course many Australians died in the terrorist attacks in Bali. How do you see the stability of our region and the threat from our immediate neighbours?
Well, we have made real progress in our region, and the best news of the last 10 years in our region is the close cooperation between Indonesia and Australia. Didn't happen by accident. We invested an enormous amount of money and also political and police and military effort into building that partnership. The way in which the Indonesian authorities cooperated with the Australian Federal Police, vice versa, in tracking down those responsible for Bali, it was a wonderful illustration. And this is very important because Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world, the most populous Muslim country in the world, and the success of a moderate Islamic government in Indonesia, which is what we now have, is really first-class news, because in the long run, we want to see a situation that within Islam, the fanatical fringe is always rejected, and the great bulk of Islamic people around the world abhor the violence associated with terrorism and with those who obscenely use the Islamic religion as a sanction for what they're doing, and that's a very welcome development. So I think we've made some progress despite the tragedy of Bali. Within our own country, we have foiled potential attacks. We changed the laws, we gave the police and we gave ASIO and all the security services a lot more resources. All of that was a good investment. And once again, it's a question of asking yourself, if we hadn't have done that, where would we be? I say we would have been a lot worse off. And our fundamental liberties haven't been touched. I mean, okay, people don't like searches at airports, but it's a very small price. It's a very small disruption that we all should happily put up with for a greater good and a greater safety.
Well, John Howard, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this day with us.
Thank you.